He would often drive this area in the evening time and report feelings of being watched. I gave him a pretty hard time about it, thinking he was just being crazy until I had my very own experience when one evening, after midnight, I was riding through here by myself. This has happened to me twice now. I'm not sure if this is the same being, but there are some details that seem to be similar enough for me to conclude that these are related encounters. It was Thursday evening on June of 1994. I was already a veteran here, having served in Desert Storm in 91 to 92. I was riding my motorcycle home from work around midnight that night. It was about a mile or so, approximately, right out of Appomattox, Virginia, and I noticed something strange. I often came home late enough where it was dark and encountered headlights on the road coming towards me, but tonight, it seemed like there were none. Since this road is very heavily traveled, there are no crossroads. There should have been no cars out here at this time. As I pulled up to the crest of a hill and started to descend, approximately 300 to 400 feet from the crest, I saw something that nearly made me soil myself. I don't know how else to describe what I was seeing, except that it looked like a giant, upright, walking ape, covered in hair, running along the road, with its arms pumping furiously as it ran after my motorcycle. It kind of reminded me of a gorilla, running on all fours, but also standing upright every now and then to try and gain full speed. The most frightful thing about it were its eyes. They were glowing this white yellow, and they almost seemed to glow in the dark, the same way headlights illuminate a deer's eyes. It's as if they possessed their own light source. Now, this thing ran after me for about a good 300 feet, until I crested another hill. But when I looked back, it had vanished. It was almost as if the thing had just disappeared into thin air. In all honesty, it scared the crap out of me. And after thinking about it for a while now, I think this thing must have been traveling so fast, it was chasing after the light from my motorcycle. That is what probably caught its attention in the first place. But the strange part about it all is that not once did I hear any noise coming from whatever this thing was. Even though it looked like a large gorilla running on two legs, it never really made a sound. From what I saw from it, it was real ugly looking, like it was deformed or something, and even had horns, pulled back like a ram's horns are. It also had this nasty smell like a skunk. Believe me or not, this is one story I won't leave me alone until I get it off my chest. It sounds pretty stupid to some people when you try and explain what happened, but if anybody has heard of similar encounters along these lines, please let me know. I do not know what this being is or where it came from. If anybody has any insight onto what this thing was, let me know in the comments below. I am also aware there have been reports of strange creatures in this area, including Bigfoot sightings and strange otherworldly type encounters with UFOs and even other bizarre paranormal phenomena. But what in the world is going on around here? This stuff is scaring people, including me. I was deployed for over a year in Afghanistan. It was one of the most unique and terrifying experiences of my life. I was walking back to the base alone one night, deep in the night. Everything was silent for miles. In the desert night, you can really hear just about everything. There were no city lights in sight. The night was black, and the only illumination came from my flashlight, which cut a small beam through the darkness. The base, however, was well lit, so there was ample light to see the ground at my feet. I heard an unfamiliar noise off in the distance, which kind of reminded me of a woman screaming as I'm patrolling. I was a little concerned and took off my helmet, adjusted the volume of my radio. Just as I did this, these horrible, what I can describe as demonic screams started coming from all directions around me. Completely unsure of what to do, I made the decision to stay where I was until I could properly assess what was happening. After a few minutes, this large light materialized about 45 meters into the air above me. It circled around me for a minute or two with this horrible screaming sound coming from it. I kept my weapon aimed at the sky, waited to see if anything else would happen. It seemed to nearly pulsate in light and emit this loud noise. I began to think that this was some sort of cloaking device before dematerializing. Several other of the soldiers saw it too, but nobody could figure out what it was. When I got home, I told my wife about the situation, and she seemed to believe that I saw a UFO of some kind. I myself am not exactly sure, but it is something I cannot explain to this day. Also, I was in Iraq in 2010 and witnessed another strange thing. One night, around 3:30 a.m., I took up my guard position on the roof of a police station, and suddenly, this green light enveloped everything. It appeared that some sort of craft was flying over us, but nobody else saw it at the time. Apparently, I was the only one to notice this, and even when I talked about it with fellow soldiers, nobody seemed to understand what I was saying, like they were never present for it, even though they were only several yards away from me. While I was a Marine stationed at Quantico Marine Base, Virginia, I came back home from a 12-hour shift on base, very late at night. This was sometime after midnight. Being the only vehicle left in the parking lot for quite some time due to my shift, I parked closest to the building as possible, for fear of somebody breaking into it overnight. I was half asleep while walking around my car, inspecting it carefully to make sure that nobody had tampered with anything that may cause problems later on. Growing up in my teenage years, I've had my car broken into twice, and had somebody try to cut the brakes underneath my car. To say I'm paranoid is an understatement and very, what I would say, justifiable. With my keys already at hand, feeling around, looking for them under dim light, coming from one of the building's windows, thinking about how much sleep I was going to get before work again tomorrow morning, I noticed something not being right with what I could only tell if I looked closer. A strange, hairy humanoid figure that was crouched down very low to the ground, causing me to literally freeze and dead in my tracks right before it sprung up like a coiled spring. It took off running with its back turned to me very fast, covering at least 30 yards in only a matter of seconds without tripping over anything it had to hurdle over. The only thing visible was its massive shoulder height next to a large tree trunk as it ran by, disappearing from sight behind a building. The hair on the creature looked coarse and blackish brown, or even dark gray maybe. Not sure why I thought though there were no other colors present. Its hair seemed matted down, flat against its skin, except for the shoulders where they laid somewhere long just past them, standing straight up as if being held by water or some type of oil, a slippery substance. It was so large that it really caught me off guard, and my best guess is if it was running by at least 30 to 40 miles an hour, if not faster. It stood on 2 feet, and its arms hung down to about its knees. I had read a story of somebody else who had seen something similar, but in another state. But I can remember word for word that he said, because it sounded almost identical, except the creature he saw apparently ran on all fours and grabbed a deer with its massive hands, throwing it over a high-voltage electrical fence. I can't say for certain that I saw the same thing, but it was definitely a huge hairy hominid. I think what's scary is who knows how long that thing had been there before I walked up, watching me. If the Marines weren't so strict on where you can and can't walk to within a half-mile radius of the base, then it would probably still be there. I encountered a creature on July 23rd, 2015, right around 10 p.m. I live in a small town called Penfield in Clearfield County, Pennsylvania. I was driving home from work on a Boy Scout road in Penfield, and I saw a large brownish tan creature crouching on the side of the road. It had a very large misshapen head, yellowish eyes, and a very long nose, kind of, dare I say, goblin-like. At this point, I slammed my foot into the gas pedal and did not let off the gas until I reached my home. I'm a very factual-based person, and I don't hold any personal beliefs as far as supernatural things are concerned. But since that night, I don't know what to think anymore. The reason I'm writing this is because I saw that thing back in November. See, I have a friend who is a sergeant. He claims to have seen a goat man back in the fall of last year as well. This is all the information I can really give you for now. If you need any more, please feel free to ask me. The first incident took place nearly 25 years ago now. I was stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Went camping with a friend of mine in the southern part of the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. This is an isolated area where you can only gain access by boat or four-wheel drive vehicle. We arrived at our destination around 8 p.m. on a Saturday evening. After setting up camp, we decided to do some fishing before it got dark. It would take about 15 minutes to get open water by boat, so we left the campsite with 4 or 5 other guys who were also spending the night there. One member of our party noticed some tracks on the eastern shore of the river. We quickly got our flashlights and were amazed to see 15-inch long humanoid-like tracks in the sand. These tracks were only about 2 feet apart and ran straight down to the water's edge. The ground was soft and sandy, so we could very easily make out the shape of these prints. We didn't miss seeing the claw marks or other strange markings that would be associated with the hoax. I myself measured one track at around 17 inches long and 7 inches wide. The depth of these tracks indicated that something very heavy made them and did not notice this approach. There is no way that these were made by a bear. They were too narrow for the front paws, and the space between each step was far too large. Our other companions, who were all military policemen, did not want to stay around very long, so we decided to follow the tracks upstream, against our gut instinct. After about 30 minutes, all of our flashlights died in unison, as if some electrical outage happened. We had replaced all the batteries prior to this trip, so we couldn't figure out why this happened. But it became very dark very quickly, and we began hearing strange sounds in the distance, kind of like heavy breathing. This went on for hours, and since nobody wanted to spend any more time there than necessary, we returned back to camp. I've always wondered what made those footprints. I believe this area is heavily populated with Sasquatches. And soon after this incident, I read an article about an upcoming Sasquatch hunt in this very area. One of the hunters who was interviewed claimed that he had seen 15-inch tracks about 1 month earlier on the Alligator River. Several other sources also mentioned seeing these huge footprints around the Fort Bragg area. Now, the second incident took place almost 3 years after, while attending college at Norfolk State University. My girlfriend and I at the time were working part-time for a private security firm. We had to monitor some abandoned buildings that were having issues with break-ins. The first few nights were pretty well, but by Saturday night, things had got really bad. We both kept hearing these loud screams all night, beyond in the woods, sounding like someone mixed a lion, a goat, and a wolf all in one, like a hybrid of some sort. It terrified us. Worse, it seemed to be coming from all directions. There was no way to track the sound. It would seem like it was coming from the north, then all of a sudden, the southeast. This went on for roughly 3 hours. We could hear there were multiples of them, whatever they were, but they weren't any normal animals I'd ever heard in my life. We've known other military servicemen who've also had some pretty bone-chilling experiences with these creatures in the area. It seems like this is a common occurrence here in the South. I know for a fact that something is awry out here in these woods. Sometimes even my own rifle don't make me feel safe. Normally, I'd never been a believer in or a sightee of any kind of cryptid or unknown creature. However, around 1986, I was stationed aboard the USS Tortuga, LST 1189, as a Navy Reserve officer. We had spent the day off the coast of Haiti, making sure that relief supplies were delivered to the Haitian people, who needed them very much after a hurricane had demolished their country. That night, our ship was underway on its way back to Jacksonville, Florida, where we were currently based. It was dusk, and the sky had gained considerable pinkish hues, and the sun was just starting to set in the sky. Myself and 2 other fellow lieutenants were standing on the open bridge, the wings of the ship watching Haiti fade on the horizon. As we looked over the port side of the ship, One of us three said he saw a flying creature. It was dark, so it really stood out against the pink sky. It was headed toward our ship, at least the direction, from ahead of us into port. The first statement of any of us made was that it must be some kind of large bird. If you had seen the size of our propellers on the ship, you would know that a bird could get caught in it and be torn to pieces, assuming it was a large water bird that dove underneath the water. It kind of resembled a huge bat, though, the closer it got. Long pointed ears and a long tail. We were trying to figure out what kind of bird this was when we lost sight of it behind the mast of the ship. As it rounded the front of the bridge, we lost sight of it again. Then, as our eyes followed it beyond the bow, we saw that this creature was now flying alongside of us. Our claims at first were now countered by these around us, suggesting that perhaps it wasn't a bird. But now, those gathered on deck were laughing and pointing at the creature as it flew along with us. One statement I remember was that it has got to be a bird. But this thing kept flying, and we can now see its bright red eyes glaring down onto the deck of our ship. As any of you who have ever seen a bat up close, their eyes shine with an amazing red light, which you can see coming out of them, even in the darkness. Now, being at night, with no real background reference to compare its size with, we were all wondering what this could possibly be. We agreed that it wasn't a goose or a condor, but maybe a pelican? Although I have never seen a pelican that resembled a bat. We witnessed it flying alongside of us for about 5 minutes. Then it began to glide away from the ship and across the horizon. The last we saw of it was a tiny dot on the horizon where its eyes had been glaring at us when it had glided over the water's surface. We never exactly figured out what it was, and none of us were ever believers in cryptids or strange creatures before this. I do feel that whatever we saw was some form of unknown species. Hi. First, a bit about me. I served in the Navy for 20 years as a military police officer. I am now retired after many years in the security industry. The following incident happened to me about 5 weeks ago whilst on holiday at my mum's farm, which is situated in southern Scotland. It was around 5 p.m. and the sun had just set. It was getting dark quite quickly. I was walking up to my vehicle, parked at the side of her house where she lives with her partner, when my attention was drawn towards one of my mum's field by some odd-appearing lights, which were kind of hovering above in the sky. These lights were glowing bright white, but they appeared to be descending slowly, almost as if they were dropping down into the field. As I got closer, the lights became apparent that there were actually now 2 white lights, both of which were the same size, but now one was beginning to get larger than the other. I crept closer, getting about 50 yards within these lights, and the large white light began to move towards me at a slow pace and then almost hovering above me before disappearing. It appeared to be at least as big as a house, maybe bigger if anything. There were no visible features on this object whatsoever, just 2 bright white lights which appeared to be projecting downwards. The smaller medium-sized light remained in the field below it for another few minutes until it too headed off in the distance, where I lost sight of it completely. The larger light then re-emerged before disappearing again back into thin air after leaving this tiny blur trace behind it. The only thing that's strange that I've dealt with while on Scottish soil. When I was younger, I also dealt with something of a beast in the Scottish woods. The incident happened when I was out walking in the woods with my family. We were all enjoying our walk when it started to get dark, so we turned around and headed back towards home. It wasn't long before I noticed something following us, but at first, I didn't think too much of it, being naive about such phenomenons. But then this thing began to run through the trees, keeping pace beside me, alongside my family. Knowing that something was wrong, I quickly shouted for everybody to run ahead, while trying not to lose sight of them at the same time. The creature moved faster, though despite its size, even faster than myself, which is surprising due to the amount of times I've served in combat zones, abroad where adrenaline can be flowing through your body constantly. No matter how fast I ran, I can never gain ground on it. And what's more is that the deeper we went into the woods, this thing just seemed to be getting bigger too. When we reached a clearing, I quickly hid behind some shrubs, trying not to let this beast see me as my family escaped. It continued to grow in size until there was no mistaking its identity. It looked like a mutated bear, carved out of stone almost, with large ears, which were almost elven in shape, and a much more elongated head, with 2 horns protruding from its forehead and 9 eyes, like some freakish arachnid. It was terrifying. I also spotted another smaller creature looking around it as well. It wasn't as big, but it looked just as striking. Not a sound did either of these things make. This was one of the most unnerving things of all. The creatures saw one another and headed off into the distance, I think still looking for me and the family, although I'm not too sure. To this day, I cannot explain what these things were, only that they were definitely not from this world. Far more terrifying than anything that I've ever seen while serving. I will say that if it wasn't for my training, I probably wouldn't be alive today. I can tell you the exact year and month this happened. It was in 1979, in April, that my own battalion received orders to ship out for the USMC Recruit Depot in San Diego, California. I was in weapons company of the 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines at Camp Lejeune in Jacksonville, North Carolina. After my basic training in Parris Island, South Carolina, and infantry training at Camp Geiger, I had become a rifleman assigned to 3rd Platoon of the Lima Company. When we left for San Diego, it took a day and a half by train to get there, most of us having never been outside the California's borders before, so this was an adventure. Once arriving in California at MCRD, I had my first taste of real fighting from some Marine Corps drill instructors. Once I made it through the MCRD hell, I shipped out to Camp Pendleton for further training before being assigned a unit. That is when I met Mr. Bill. What is strange about this story is my past experience with large flying creatures had me slightly prepared for what was coming next. I have never ever read or seen any type of large flying reptilian creature in any science fiction movie or story, but I have read about and seen a pterodactyl one time before. This was during my high school years, when I went on a field trip with a bunch of classmates to the local museum. In the huge atrium, there was a very old mounted wingless pterodactyl on display. I think it had been there for at least 20 years, maybe more, before I saw it. The thing was sitting upright, on its tail. The wings were spread out to the sides of its body like some type of prehistoric leathery aircraft. It looked like something off of a low-budget science fiction film, set or prop. It really gave me the heebie-jeebies, because here was this monster that had lived and died during prehistoric times. It was scary just looking at it. So, of all that, made my first experience with Mr. Bill's little baby pterodactyl less than disturbing to me than it might have been to somebody else who had never saw something like that before. All Marines in my battalion had been seeing these things too. I know, because they resembled somewhat the pterodactyl that I saw with Mr. Bill. Sometimes you'd see them flying around during dusk, off in the far distance. Other times, they'd be higher up towards the mountains, but they were unmistakable to see. But more on that in a minute. Back to my story about the Marine Corps Recruit Depot. It was around the first week of May when myself and a bunch of fellow Marines were on parade ground, more or less waiting for something or other. We were all lined up at attention, not moving much at all, except for some shifting. And just then, I happened to glance in the direction of a very distant mountain, about a mile or two away, and there in the air, high above something, caught my attention. I figured it was a bird, but it was so large. But when it made a big, lazy U-turn and came back in our direction, I could not believe what my eyes had saw. The thing was huge, a large winged reptile, but you could see that it looked nothing like a bird due to its size alone. The wingspan was 3 times the normal size of a condor. I looked around to see if anybody else saw what I was seeing, but everybody's eyes were straight down in the position of attention, so they could not have been looking anywhere else except for ahead towards the drill instructor up on his little platform. It was then that I figured out the only reason why the DI had not said anything about the giant flying thing in the sky was that he probably saw it too. I just happened to look up in its direction, and it had come back around, headed into our general direction again, coming from behind a very tall barrack building. It came closer until it passed overhead, right above, where we were all standing at attention on the parade grounds. I could see it all very clearly. It was a huge creature with bat-like wings and a long, skinny tail. The whole encounter could not have lasted for more than a few seconds, but it flew off towards the mountains again. And I'll never forget the direction and the general outline of what I had seen, and how it looked nothing like any type of bird at all that I've ever seen in my life. This was the very first time all of us saw one. Even the locals and natives there recognized them and even talk about them. If there's ever a place that Jurassic Park exists, it's there, in Papua New Guinea. My name is Rick, but you can call me Terrace. That was, after all, my nickname in Iraq. I had a few buddies who called me that. I guess it's like some kind of slang. War is hell. But over there, they played by a different set of rules. Anyway, I was in the military for about 8 years, and since then, have worked as some kind of private contractor for the last 5. I don't know if I should be telling you this story, but anyway, even if your website says anonymous, you never know how safe things are nowadays with all the cybercrime and cyber terrorism going on. It didn't take long after getting off duty to head out towards home, which is just outside of town near this farm that my parents used to own, long before they passed. It's not much, just a little place where I store food now and keep my own personal things. But in a way, it is home to me. Feels good to get out of the country, after being in that desert for so long. It was already dark when I got off the road about 10 miles from home. Maybe thanks to all those darn clouds blocking out any of that beautiful moonlight. So I figured with the darkness setting in very fast, no sense in wasting time. I got out my Magnum flashlight and continued on foot across the bumpy gravel path towards the farm buildings ahead of me, which were now barely visible in this thick black darkness. I made my way past some trees and overgrown vegetation lining the road, until I came upon an old pathway that leads to the backside of my parents' old farmhouse. Earlier in the day, I couldn't help but notice that this pathway looked like it had been trampled over by something large, so decided to come out here and investigate what was going on. It didn't take long to see where these large tracks were being made across this part of the farmland. The grass was already flattened down by something very heavy walking back and forth through here multiple times, just short of the summer season. It wasn't hard to me to figure out whatever caused these prints in the ground was probably pretty big, easily 9 or 10 feet tall, if not more, given how wide apart each set of footprints were, apart from each other. So I came upon a small clearing and stopped, shone my flashlight just ahead of me, and I heard an awful sound that still haunts me to this day. A blood-curdling howl followed by a hissing, a crackling and rumbling, immediately making the hairs on the back of my arms stand up in fear. I've done some bad things in Iraq, but nothing like what was going on right in front of me. At first sight, my flashlight beam only lit up part of it before its eyes. It was large and black-looking before standing fully upright. Its wide shoulders and massive chest were, from what I could tell seeing, covered in a reddish-brown fur. It was hunched over as it looked through the tall grass, partially hiding it. At first, I assumed maybe it was some kind of bear, but as my light hit its eyes, they glowed this bright orange amber. It was like 2 hot glowing coals bathed in crimson anger. Short for a Bigfoot, but no more than 6 feet tall, if I had to guess. All that muscle definition everywhere you looked on its body. What kind of species this thing belonged to eluded me. Other than knowing whatever it actually was, it wasn't human-friendly. I stood there, frozen with terror, staring right back at this creature whose size alone would have easily outweighed me by over 100 pounds, if not more. The jaws on this thing were large and black, opening up so wide I could now see down its throat, as it let out this other unholy howl that made the ground shake underneath our feet. This must be what a deer feels like when looking into an approaching freight train that's about to run it over. The only thing we had between us was an open field and darkness surrounding us, both during this tense moment of fear and trepidation. The creature wasn't moving towards me at first, for some reason. I knew that engaging with it would have resulted in a death sentence, so simply, I retracted. After the initial shock wore off, I slowly backed away from this thing, while keeping my light pointing right at it. It continued to just stand there, seeming to be just as afraid of me as I was of it, or so it acted that way. Why did it come into the clearing in the first place? We kind of just stood there having a face-off for what felt like an eternity before I made a mistake that probably would have sealed my fate. In order to back away from this thing, who did not advance towards me but rather stayed where it was, I had no choice but to turn around and run back across the field. Now, I want to say this because it's important. Never, and I mean never, do you turn your back and run from a large predator, especially one like this that's unknown. You just don't do it. It entices them to chase you. That's exactly what happened, and I was not even armed when this happened either. I was about halfway across the clearing when I heard it coming after me before jumping down and disappearing into the brush, just mere feet away from me. I don't care if you don't believe. You don't have to. I'm telling you the terror of that night is real, and what I endured is real. I had more than enough time to take a good look at this creature, and would most certainly remember what it looked like. I will never forget that face as long as I live. With those eyes staring into my very soul with pure hatred, it's forever embedded into my memory. I have no idea how fast this thing could have chased me down, but I know it would have made a meal out of me if given the chance. As soon as I cleared the trees and got back to around my house, I ran inside, locked every door and window before going up to my bedroom, which was on the second floor of the house with a balcony outside facing where I'd just come from. I didn't sleep the entire evening, but the following morning, I actually insisted on staying at a hotel for that time being. Too many strange things were going on around the property, and I wasn't going to take any chances of being mauled to death by some monster. Whether this was a Bigfoot or Dogman or whatever, they are real. The next day after what just happened, I finished paying up at the hotel, which had its own little restaurant connected to it, providing pretty good food. So the front desk person wanted to talk to me about what happened last night, after I kind of gave him a little bit of info on me and what I went through. They told me something very interesting about my ordeal that made me feel more uneasy all over again. He said the hunters who use the fields behind the house and around have seen these large black dogs out there, the largest wolves they've ever seen before, but only during deer hunts, which is the only time of the year that deer are in the area. Can you believe that? I never knew there were wolves here, but the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. These are large unknown canids, and I don't want anything to do with it. Not my story, but my grandfather's actually, who served during Vietnam. Now, he's never been one to really share his stories and things with anyone, but he will sometimes. He recently, just in the last couple of years, noticed that I took a liking to cryptozoology and things of that realm. After learning that it's even a thing, he began to tell me how during the Vietnam War, which again he served in, a part of the platoon he was in was attacked by these large, 10-foot tall, reptilian, crocodilian creatures. They killed at least 8 of his men. His story terrified me when he told me it, and so I'll share it with you. He said that his platoon had been in a long and grueling march through the jungle. They were really close to where they were going, but had one more obstacle to go through. A river that would take half a day at least to cross with all their gear. They were already in the midst of a very thick part of the jungle, and with their current location, it would be tougher. So they waited for nightfall before crossing. There were Viet Cong soldiers in the area, and they wanted to wait for them to pass. Everybody except for the point man who had went ahead of the group to scout out the crossing. He said that after about an hour or so he returned with wild, terrified eyes, asked if they could get across without making too much noise, due to there was something large in the river. Well, my grandfather said they did their best, but it was still quite noisy when they got in the water. He heard this strange, almost trumpet-like noise he described in the distance. It sounded like it was coming from the direction of the river. At first, they thought it might be maybe a kind of animal or something, but after a few seconds, It became clear that there were too many weird things about these noises that did not pinpoint back to any animal, so they simply kept moving. By the time they got to about the halfway point, night had fallen, and because of this, my grandfather said he only saw one dark shape in the river when he made its way under them that disappeared after about a second or two. He said that besides that one, in that one moment, nothing too much seemed out of the ordinary besides the noises, but you could tell everybody was very uneasy. Once everybody got across the river and onto land again, his point man set up to keep watch for a few moments while everybody else tried to get a bit of sleep. He claims that 5 minutes into the guard shift, nothing seemed wrong at all, but then saw 2 or 3 of these dark shapes in the water that began to ascend out of the water. Quick note, this section that they were in was a very thick part of the jungle, he told me. Even the captured Vietnamese refused to travel through here, and when questioned, they acted very scared. They knew. Anyway, he said that the first thing he did was wake everybody up, and for some reason, his point man wouldn't respond. After a second of shock, he realized this as well, as the fact that their point man was no longer on post, but had now been dragged into the water. My grandfather said at this point, everybody began to panic. Some went for their guns and others tried to get a better look at whatever was in the river. It wasn't long before they realized that this thing had killed off half their men, including their point man, taken in their sleep. He said there were 3 or 4 of these creatures in the water, coming out and going back in. Everybody started shooting at them, but it didn't do much other than make things worse. At first, they thought it was just because there were so many men shooting, and then he noticed that some of the bullets would go through one of these creatures, and after a second or two, another creature on the same side as the other one would rise up out of the water and eat what was left of the comrade on shore. He said everybody tried to run away at this point, but some didn't make it back into the jungle in time before watching everything they had ever had become eaten by these things. They went into hiding for hours until dawn finally came around. Apparently, during this time, he wasn't sure if he was awake or dreaming, when more than once he heard screams sound off in the distance. He knew those were his teammates being eaten and torn alive. He told me that none of this seemed real if he closed his eyes, but when in the daylight, it was a different story. He told me that in a few short hours, they finally heard a chopper in the distance and began to signal them with their gun mags. He said that when they got to where my grandfather and some of his friends were at, they were all left. There was just bones and bits of meat and flesh from these creatures. He told me he never returned to that part of the jungle again, and making the shortcut was a huge mistake. He told me this story about 10 years ago. It still keeps me up at night, sometimes thinking about what happened. This is the only time my grandfather would ever talk about running into large humanoid crocodilian creatures. And no, these weren't just regular crocodiles. These were something out of a nightmare. They had a taste for human flesh. Back in the 1980s, I was stationed in Prague, Czechoslovakia, within the US military. I came home to visit my family for Christmas, and while at their house, me and my stepfather got into a heated argument about politics of all things. At one point, he said something that really pissed me off so much, I decided not to stay any longer. It would only lead to trouble between us both. So, after spending some time with him, I walked out the door on him without giving any notice or saying goodbye to anybody else in my family. My wife was busy at work when this happened, so she did not have an opportunity to say goodbye either. This was around 4 p.m. in the evening. I began walking down the street where my car is parked, just a few blocks away. As I'm walking along, I hear this very loud whooshing sound directly overhead. At first, I thought it was maybe a helicopter as this thing had passed overhead, or at least oncoming, but it sounded nothing like one. The noise this thing reminded me of was what you'd hear like if you took a time-lapse recording from maybe an aircraft carrier or something similar. It sounded as though there were multiple engines within the object as well, due to the various levels of pressure coming from different directions, which kind of created an oscillating effect that shook everything below it, adding to this deafening sound the closer it came. In order for me to understand what this was, I ran as fast as I could to my car, threw it in reverse and started speeding up to the street to get back onto the main highway. As I'm pulling out of the parking spot on that side of the street, I see it for the first time. This thing flies right across my windshield and overhead. My first thought was, oh no, because now that it's close up, I can see this thing has a distinct human form, and although its body seems elongated and muscular, like an athlete or something similar, it had wings on its arms which made me think of a bat but without fur or any feathery appendages. It also had legs with feet, so large that from the distance I saw it, I would have never believed it were real, had I not seen this with my own eyes. As this thing was flying overhead, it turned its head and looked right at me with a very menacing glare that totally said, "I see you." I'll never forget the feeling of being busted for doing something wrong by somebody old enough to be your father. That's what this thing felt like. And it had a long protruding snout, kind of like a beak or maybe an anteater or something similar, and very large orbish black eyes. Its skin and face was also very pale. When I drove off, I looked back to see where it went. The thing was gone, just like a ghost. I never knew they were in this area until after my encounter with them, but I read about similar sightings happening online. This really surprised me at the time. I'd never seen anything like it or even heard anybody else talk about them until now that I know about their existence. I'm talking about gargoyles. My unit and I were stationed at a training base in the Croatian National Forest. We were told that there had been sightings of this creature, and it was very dangerous. So we were on guard for anything really. One night, while driving with my navigator, I saw something very large go up in a tree about 100 to 150 yards from the road. My NCOIC also saw this and identified it as a cryptid. I didn't know what that was. I was too busy concentrating on driving in order to avoid hitting whatever it was. Because it happened so fast, I was convinced it was going to land right in the road. So I have no idea what kind of being it was. What we saw was a large, long, dark-furred creature leap from off a dirt road and into the middle of the road. It had been standing next to a tree just outside the woodline that runs parallel to this very desolate stretch of rural highway. It quickly leaps out of view from the road, off into the tree line, disappearing for good at that point. I was just a young soldier at the time. It is the only cryptid sighting of my entire life. It had been a clear night with rain earlier that day, so visibility was good, even into the woods that were about 20 to 50 yards from each side of this two-lane road. We stopped and got out to take a look around, but with no flashlight. We had no real idea of what direction to walk. To be honest, I was too freaked out to go into the woods for a closer look myself. We both said that whatever it was must have moved through very quickly and back off into the darkness. We did not hear anything past our own hearts racing at this point. I've been in the army now for 23 years, and not much phases me anymore. The one thing that will always stick out in my mind was this encounter. I am a believer of UFOs, but when it comes to cryptids, such as Bigfoot or whatever it was, if it leaves tracks you can find them, then I'm more than willing to believe it exists. Here's another story. I was at Fort Bragg. It was about 1 a.m. I was sitting on the ground outside, waiting for a security checkpoint to clear, when I heard something crashing through the trees just over my shoulder towards my right side. If you imagine yourself in that situation, then you have a good example of how I felt. I heard this crashing through the woods sound not more than 20 feet behind me, but there was nothing to be seen other than the trees shaking like crazy. When I turned around and looked, I saw something brown about the size of a small bear covered in fur with black hair all over its face. It kind of had a long tail and pointy ears and no hair on the very top of its face. I would say it was maybe no more than 200 pounds. I began to get very scared and started to pull out my pistol when this thing turned and saw me, ran back into the woods, and was now gone. I felt like it wasn't going to hurt anybody and that I was safe, but if you saw this thing, you would understand why I started reaching for my pistol. The whole encounter maybe lasted 5 to 10 seconds at most. I found this old report, and I thought you would find it of interest. The lieutenant is anonymous, but his sighting is horrible sounding. At 04:15 on the morning of July 18th, 1944,